Hello and welcome to another flipped classroom lesson from Students of History. Today we're going to be looking at Latin American independence movements and those in the Caribbean, and a look at some of the revolutionaries and liberators of South America and Latin America. As always, there's a guided notes worksheet you can use to follow along with this. There's also the interactive notebook foldable style as well. Both can be used perfectly with this presentation. If you use the interactive notebook style, just take a note at where you're filling in the information for each one, because it represents more geographically than it does in order. And also you can kind of color and label the map as well. We're going to start things off in Haiti, which was the first of these nations to achieve independence. And this kind of all goes back to the French Revolution period and the American Revolution. The American Revolution, of course, began with the shot heard around the world. It's referred to that because this really was heard around the world. In 1776, the beginning of the American Revolution was successful by 1787. Word spread. And in Haiti, Haiti was not yet known as Haiti, though it was known as Saint-Domingue. And in August of 1791, when this revolution started, it is estimated that there were about 450,000 enslaved African men, women, and children on that island. There were some free Africans, about 28,000, while the whites on the island of Saint-Domingue numbered about 40,000. And this was a French colony, and it was a very prosperous French colony. It's estimated that 40% of the sugar in the whole world was produced on this island. So it was brought incredible wealth to France. But of course that wealth came on the backs of slave labor, and one of those enslaved men was named Toussaint Louverture. You can see him pictured there in that portrait. Toussaint Louverture was incredibly well educated and charismatic. He was born and raised in slavery, enslaved, but he learned to read and write and was very charismatic and he knew about the Enlightenment, and he knew about revolutions going around the world that he learned about. And he would go on to fight against the Spanish when they invaded to try to put down this rebellion. He fought against the British when they came to their aid, and of course he fought against France. A number of armies that Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the leader of France at this time after the French Revolution, sent there to try to defeat him. Toussaint Louverture fought with about 100,000 enslaved Africans and Haitians who rose up in rebellion during this insurgency, if you want to call it that, this revolutionary movement. And it would take about over 10 years that they would be fighting these various armies. Toussaint Louverture was taken captive, though, in a sort of sneaky move by the French, where he was signing a treaty, a deal with them, and then they kidnapped him basically and sent him to prison in the Alps. Taking over for Toussaint Louverture is the guy you see pictured here, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Jean-Jacques Dessalines took up the revolutionary movement after Toussaint Louverture in Saint-Domingue, and he is going to be the one who officially declares independence for Haiti in 1804. He won a string of victories against the French armies who were coming over there. A lot of the French armies were devastated with disease as well when they came to Haiti. The last of the French troops left the island in 1803. Napoleon acknowledged defeat. The great general Napoleon, who was trying to conquer all of Europe, was defeated here in Saint-Domingue, or Haiti. And after this victory, of course, they abolished slavery formally on the island. Jean-Jacques Dessalines became the new ruler of an independent nation. They named the island Haiti, which comes from the Arawak native language meaning mountainous land, which is a bit of a mountainous land. And it became the first nation to ban slavery. It became the first example of a successful rebellion of enslaved men, women, and children to rise up and create their own nation. as well. So it was a momentous moment in history, in Western history, and Haiti has been an independent nation since then. Well, in South America, to the south of Haiti, of course, now, these were all either Spanish colonies for the most part, or Brazil would be a Portuguese colony. And there were some Dutch colonies like Dutch Guiana and French Guiana as well, but for the most part it was Spanish and Dutch. And they dominated Latin America ever since the Columbian Exchange, for 200 to 300 years at this point in about the year 1800 now. The Columbian Exchange was the early 1500s. So for close to 300 years, they had been dominating Latin America, bringing great wealth back to themselves. The governments in Europe, the Spanish government, controlled this trade for its own benefit. Not so much at all the benefit of the people there. They placed people in control who are known as viceroys. The viceroys would be these royal officials who would rule over like New Granada or Guyana, or the Viceroyalty of Buenos Aires, or these different regions that you would see on the map there. And the viceroys were always born in Europe. They had to be born in Spain or Portugal. They could not be born in the New World, and we'll look at some reasons why going forward and who these different groups are. But this all goes back to the economic system of the time, which is known as mercantilism. Mercantilism was the dominant political or economic philosophy of the 1700s, where colonies are designed and created just for the benefit of the mother country. The mother country is the European country, the country that's kind of conquering these areas, and colonies are supposed to enrich the mother country, and they do that by producing goods, either growing crops or whether it's sugar or tobacco, or indigo or rice or what have you, and those would go back to the mother country, and the colonies could only buy their manufactured goods from, let's say, Spain or Portugal. They couldn't be trading with England or any other nations because they wanted that wealth all condensed to that one country. So they were under very, very strict laws about this. They were under very strict economic penalties for disobeying mercantilism, and obviously the people in these areas are suffering as well. You have especially the indigenous populations of these regions would be treated horrifically by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and they also brought in African slaves, and slavery was dominant in much of this region as well. Well, looking at that class system that we mentioned, in Spanish America and some other places, these racial categories or ethnic categories were very legal classifications. And there were three dominant racial categories in this rigid class system. Much like in ancient India or in Middle Ages India, there was the caste system. Well, there was a very rigid class system in European colonization in the New World, and it really presented an unequal distribution of power and wealth too among Latin Americans based off of your birth and who your parents were. Was the dominant force in how great your life would be or how poor your life would be, or where the jobs you could hold and things like that. And this class system had different legal classifications in society. You can sort of see some of them here in this portrait of different groupings. This painting from the 18th century showing 16 sort of different racial groupings based off of different parents and children. And we'll take a look at some of them here. At the top of society were the peninsulares. The peninsulares are those born in Spain or Portugal, because Spain and Portugal are a peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula, the Peninsular War, which was between Spain and France. So peninsulares are those born in Spain who are sent to the New World to be in charge. The viceroys were all peninsulares. Those high government officials, the ones in charge, the ones who controlled society, were all born elsewhere. They were born in Spain or in Portugal, in the case of Brazil, and sent to the New World to work, to be in charge, to rule. They are the peninsulares. They are at the top of society. They have the most rights. They have the most wealth. and they really control how everything works. Their children are known as Creoles. Creoles are people born in the New World to Spanish parents, and these are going to be the ones who are going to be the most influential in the revolution, because Creoles were considered inferior than their parents because they were born in the New World. Now, of course, they have no control over where you're born or who you're born, and they're looking at this like, why am I at a lower place in society? My parents were in charge. My parents were the viceroy. They were in charge of this whole country, and now just because I'm born here, I can never be a viceroy, and they can never be in control, and they can never have those same rights. So the desire for a revolution is going to be strongest among the Creoles. They're well educated. Many of them were sent to France or sent to Spain or sent to Portugal for school or for military training, and then they come back and they're used to being at this certain place in society, and now it's like, no, you can't be in charge, you're a Creole. And it was a very strict, classifications back then. But they knew about the Enlightenment, they knew about the American Revolution and the French Revolution and equality. So they're going to be the leaders of this revolution, the Creoles. Below them are several mixed groups, the mestizos. The mestizos are people of mixed ancestry. These are when you have European men or women intermarrying with indigenous populations. Mixed race, what you would call it, mestizos. They might be Indian and Spanish, or Portuguese and indigenous, American Indian, Native American. Comes from that mixture. They're really the backbone of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. They made up a majority of those in the army. They're your artisans, your traders, your local officials, your merchants. They're living in the cities. They are, a major part of society, this mixed group, but not nearly the rights of the Peninsulars for sure, and not even the rights of the Creoles as well. They are this mixed ancestry, and because they are all part American Indian or part indigenous, they had nowhere near the rights of even the Creoles. Further down are mulattoes. These are people of mixed African and European ancestry. So, of course, many thousands or millions of enslaved Africans were brought to the New World. Many of them, or some of them at least, intermarried with either whites or with mestizos or with indigenous populations, and this results in these, very, very diverse population. But mulattoes would be below the mestizos in society, so fewer rights, fewer freedoms, a stricter place in society, and they are mulattoes, people of mixed African and European ancestry. At the bottom of the totem pole, at the far bottom of society, would be the Native Americans, the indigenous populations themselves, the ones who were there, the ones who, this is with their nation. They were the Incan, they were the Native Americans who were across Mexico, Latin America, South America, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Mixtecs, all these different American Indian indigenous groups. They were the majority. Many of them died from disease, sadly, but they had the fewest rights in society. They were at the bottom of society in every aspect. They were the ones working the gold mines, working the silver mines for these populations, working extremely hard, dying off, sadly, at an extremely high rate. And abused in every aspect of society by the Europeans who dominated this area. So that's kind of the background of the people there. So the revolution is going to begin not long after Napoleon conquers Spain. So of course Napoleon is the French emperor for life, the first consul of France, comes to power after the French Revolution. Napoleon wants to conquer all of Europe, and he conquers Spain in 1808 and makes his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, who you see in the background there. Joseph Bonaparte is Napoleon's older brother, and Napoleon hooks him up by being the new king of Spain. He conquers Spain and makes Napoleon's brother, he makes him the king of Spain. Spanish people weren't too happy about that either. They would be fighting a guerrilla war against it. But now, since Spain is really kind of under French control, all of its colonies would be therefore under French control, and a lot of Latin American colonists refused to accept this. The viceroys in these different areas, the Creoles, those in charge, were upset about being under French control now. They didn't want to accept French rule. They also, many of them supported the ideals of the French Revolution and the American Revolution and independence, and they wanted independence. And revolutions soon broke out across Latin America after Napoleon's conquering of Spain. This is going to set like dominoes going down across the world. These actions going on in Europe is going to have a vast impact on America and on Latin America as well. So one of those Creoles who was in charge was, who wanted to be in charge was Simon Bolivar. Simon Bolivar was born in Venezuela, though technically he was born in the Captaincy General of Venezuela, as the colony was known, because it wasn't a country yet. He was born in a very wealthy, aristocratic family, but since he was born in the New World, he was a Creole. He was sent to Spain when he was just 16 to be educated. He learned about the Enlightenment there. He was in military school there. He learned military tactics. He married while he was over there. Unfortunately, his wife died just after a few months. She was very young, and Bolivar was madly in love with her and vowed to never marry again, and he didn't for the rest of his life. But he was motivated to return home to Venezuela and lead an independence movement, thinking, you know, my people should be free. We should not be second-class citizens in our homeland. And it's kind of ironic to think about how they treat the American Indians and the indigenous populations when they wanted equal rights and they wanted control, but they are, you know, treating these either holding slaves or, you know, treating the indigenous populations so poorly. So Bolivar returns to the New World and fights against the Spanish. He's going to fight against them in Colombia, in Gran Colombia as it was known, and win victories there in 1819. The independence for New Grenada, as it was known, was this kind of Gran Colombia, which is kind of the northern countries today of what we know in South America. Those northern countries of South America were what Bolivar was leading independence through. Independence for Venezuela he achieved in 1821 with a victory at the Battle of Carabobo, as it's known, officially made Venezuela an independent nation as he won independence there. But he was not done quite yet. He would soon meet another revolutionary, José de San Martín. José de San Martín, like Bolivar, was a Creole. He was born in Argentina, and so now we're looking at the southern parts of South America. He, like Bolivar, was sent to the New World for school. He spent his youth in Spain, learned to be military school. He actually fought for Spain against Napoleon in the Peninsular War, in that war between Spain and France, but he returned to Latin America and liberated Argentina and Chile from Spanish rule. He fought against the armies there, and he met Simon Bolivar at this famous meeting in 1822, known as Guayaquil, the meeting at Guayaquil. And it was this closed-door meeting, so no one's really quite sure what happened, and historians have debated about this meeting for years and years, ever since then. But Bolivar and San Martín, the two greatest generals, those known as the liberators, Simon Bolivar is known as El Liberador, the liberator of Latin America, met with José de San Martín at this closed-door meeting, and it walked out of it where San Martín gave all of his armies to Bolivar. And Bolivar then led this combined army against the Spanish in Peru, which was the last of the Spanish colonies to the holdouts, and won victory in 1822, and they liberated Peru. San Martín moved back to Europe. He went to France and lived the rest of his life in Europe after giving his army to Bolivar, and Bolivar then brought independence to Peru, and now all of the Spanish colonies in the New World have been liberated by 1824, and they have independence for all these nations. Well, a little further to the north, obviously, is Mexico. Mexico was also a Spanish colony. and it was known as New Spain. This was probably the most tightly held of all the Spanish colonies. So much wealth came from Mexico in terms of gold and silver, precious metals. Well, a priest, Padre Miguel Hidalgo, in the town of Dolores, Mexico, was inspired by the Enlightenment ideals, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment. He read often about this. He saw how the indigenous populations of Mexico were treated so poorly by the Spanish. He tried to help the poor people of his town grow olives and grapes, but the authorities, the viceroys, those Spanish and new officials in charge discouraged this or prohibited it because they wanted them to buy these goods from Spain. He was furious about this, so he issued a call for freedom, the Grito de Dolores. The Grito de Dolores is the call for freedom, or the call from Dolores. Dolores is the town where it was issued, Dolores, Mexico. And he begins the independence movement for Mexico in 1810. When they issue this Grito de Dolores, he was eventually gathered an army of about 90,000 mestizos and indigenous people. So it's a little different than the independence movements in South America. Those were mostly led by Creoles, like Bolivar and San Martin were Creoles, those of Spanish background, but born in the New World. In Mexico, it's going to be the mestizos and a lot of the indigenous populations who are going to be leading the independence movement, although it'll get a little conflicted next. Miguel Hidalgo, it's unsuccessful at first, and it takes about 10 years for this different independence movements to come together. Various people come in charge, one of whom would be Agustin de Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero. Vicente Guerrero is there on the right. He is actually of a mulatto descent. Iturbide would be a mestizo descent, and they were revolutionary generals during the War for Independence. The Mexican War for Independence is going to take a while to come together. And different kind of groups come in charge, and it actually kind of flips, where the people who were fighting against independence actually start fighting for independence when changes happen in Spain. Independence is finally achieved for Mexico in 1821, September 27th, 1821. De Iturbide will be the president of the Regency in 1821, or eventually named as Constitutional Emperor of Mexico. He reigned for a couple of years, is credited as designing the actual first Mexican flag as well. So Mexican independence takes a while, over 10 years you're talking about, but that'd be not overwhelmingly long when you think about, even the American Revolution took, close to that as well, when you go from the Declaration of Independence to, the official surrendering of the British. So take a long time, but some of these nations are all gaining independence over this similar time period. Next, we'll look at one of the last ones, which is Brazil's independence. Brazil's independence was rather unique, not nearly as violent as some of the others, and it really owes it to the Portuguese royal family. When Napoleon was invading, so going back to Napoleon, I feel like he's coming back to him. Napoleon, during the Peninsular War, of course he conquered Spain, he was invading Portugal as well. Well, the Portuguese royal family was like, screw this, we're out. And they gathered up everything they could, their whole royal court, boarded ships, and all the ships and all their, the royal court and hundreds of people and all the wealth of the palace, they put on boats and sailed for Brazil. Brazil was Portugal's #1 colony, its greatest colony. So the Portuguese royal family fled to Rio de Janeiro, and that actually became the capital of Portugal. It was like they flipped. Whereas Portugal was the mother country and Brazil was the colony, it sort of flipped when the royal family fled Napoleon and actually led the Portuguese Empire from Rio de Janeiro. The king was named King John, and his son, who we see pictured here, was Dom Pedro. Dom Pedro was only 9 years old when they fled, so really he didn't have a lot of memories of his homeland of Portugal, and he grew up in Brazil. So he had a great affinity for Brazil. He probably considered himself Brazilian, if you picture those formative years of your life being raised there. So when things kind of calmed down back home in Portugal, King John and the royal family returned to Portugal, left Brazil and returned, but Dom Pedro stayed behind. He enjoyed Brazil very much, and you can certainly understand why. It's a gorgeous country with amazing beaches and beautiful weather. So you certainly really can't argue with Prince Dom Pedro remaining. Well, once the royal family and the king went back, they were supportive. Then kind of it went back to that sort of mother country colony relationship. And the people of Brazil were sort of used to kind of, they liked the king, they liked kind of being the center, and now they're going back to being a colony. So when King John wanted to kind of return them to being a colony again, many Brazilians didn't want to accept that. And they created this petition, and thousands, 8,000 Brazilians signed this petition asking Dom Pedro to be their ruler and to make Brazil an independent nation. So they really asked the ruler, who was in charge, to say, look, we love you, we want you to be in charge, but we want to be independent. We don't want to be a colony anymore, we want you. So he still has that connection to Portugal, but he has this connection as well to Brazil. So Dom Pedro agrees and formally declares independence from Portugal in 1822, and Dom Pedro is the new ruler of Brazil. So a very kind of interesting bloodless revolution. With that connection between the two, and again going back to Napoleon's invasions of Europe, kind of setting off these dominoes across the rest of the world. Well, America, we've mentioned it several times, America is nearby watching all of this unfold. And the president in 1823 is President James Monroe. You see him pictured there. And James Monroe, he sees all this fighting going on, and he's afraid that it might expand into a bigger war. He doesn't like the Europeans meddling over here in all these nations and fighting across South America and Central America and the Caribbean. So Monroe issues a formal doctrine, this document that says Latin American nations who have fought for their independence must remain independent. This goes for Colombia and Venezuela and Haiti and Brazil and these nations who have gained their independence. And Europeans meddling and interfering in Latin America is a threat to America's peace and safety, and America will not have it. By this point, America defeated England in the Revolutionary War. It held its own in the War of 1812. Whether that's a victory or a tie is kind of up for debate. But America kind of held its own against Europeans. It doesn't want Europeans messing around in the Western Hemisphere anymore, and the Monroe Doctrine is really America standing up for itself against those European affairs and saying, hey, respect the people of Latin America, respect their independence, which some people would find ironic the way America had interfered in Latin American affairs many ways since then. But the Monroe Doctrine is issued in 1823, formally kind of telling Europeans to stay away. Another future president, Teddy Roosevelt, will add to that less than 100 years later, making America the police force of the Western Hemisphere. All right, so an exit ticket here to close things out. One of the most important aspects of these independence movements were the classes of society. The Peninsulars at the top, the Creoles, the Mestizos, the Mulattoes, the indigenous groups as well. What impact do you think that had on these independence movements? And if those were not in place, if there was not this strict classes of society, do you think independence movements might have been different? How might things have been differently, maybe, if there weren't these strict classes of society? If it wasn't so stratified and structured, and the Creoles didn't harbor this resentment against the Peninsulars, the Mestizos harboring the resentment against those above them as well. How might things have been different? Kind of something to think about for your exit ticket. I want to thank you for following along. Hopefully you learned a little bit about Simon Bolivar, the great liberator, Toussaint Louverture, the slave who defeated Napoleon, and Jose de San Martin and Father Miguel Hidalgo, and all these great revolutionaries of Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and the independence movements that they brought. Stay tuned for more flipped classroom lessons from students of history going forward. Take care, everybody.